Hello everyone, how are you? I hope that all is well with you and that you are okay and safe at home, and I hope that you are following the lectures, writing questions, writing comments, and trying to digest the material enthusiastically. um, I'm sorry that we are in this situation, but this is the time of the corona, so we have to stay home and to take our lectures as safely as possible. I remember that the last thing we explained in lecture number 8, and today we are in lecture number 9, was images. The last thing was images, yes. The use of imagery in poetry, and we finished with page 81. Today we will move on to page 82. 82 specifically is going to be about thermal imagery. And thermal imagery, as you remember, is imagery that relate to temperature, like cold, hot, etc. May God keep us away from fever and hot things during this period of time. Thermal imagery can be best illustrated if we take an example from the great romantic poet John Keats. I have a quote from one of his famous poems that talks about cold weather and cold weather versus warmth. The poem is full of images which actually describe the suffering of animals during cold weather. So here I have chosen this stanza, page 82. If we are going to have a full analysis of the images, I think it's a good idea to read the stanza. Saint Agnes' Eve. Ah, bitter chill it was. The owl, for all his feathers, was a cold. The hare limped, trembling through the frozen grass. And silent was the flock in woolly fold. Numb were the beadsman's fingers while he told his rosary, and while his frosted breath, like pious incense from a censer old, seemed taking flight for heaven without a death, past the sweet Virgin's picture, while his prayer he saith. Well, I want you to read this stanza carefully and with great appreciation. It's not enough just to listen to me reading the poem. Here, Keats brings together simple denotative statements, visual images of the suffering of animals during the cold weather. In line 1, the poet uses thermal images when he says chill, bitter chill it was. Notice the effect of bitter chill it was as a kind of inversion in the poem. He should have said it was bitter chill, but bitter chill it was is much more poetic. The poet says that it was really chilling, very, very cold. So the use of chill is an excellent example of what we call thermal imagery. Now the writer starts by talking about the suffering of animals during cold weather. The first animal which is being described here is the owl. Now the owl is a bird, and birds have feather. So despite all the warmth that we expect the feathers to provide, we notice that the owl is very cold. So although the owl has a lot of feathers, but still it is cold. Another thermal image is the use of this epithet cold. The second animal is the hare, and the hare, H-A-R-E, is a kind of wild rabbit. Wild rabbit. While the hare limped trembling through the frozen grass. This image is my favorite in this stanza. It's very beautiful and very expressive. The poet describes the wild rabbit, while the wild rabbit is trying to walk over the grass, but unfortunately the grass is very, very cold, so much so that the rabbit cannot really do it without limping, L-I-M-P, limping. So the hare is limping and at the same time trembling. It is trembling through the frozen grass. So we notice the use of a frozen here. Frozen is an epithet and it shows a thermal image. So notice the beauty of this image. We have a combination of visual, kinesthetic, and thermal images. Visual, because in our mind we can imagine a wild rabbit limping and trembling at the same time through the frozen grass. So this is visual. But when you think of the epithet frozen, this is thermal. When you think of the act of trembling, then we are talking about kinesthetic images. The fourth line, and silent was the flock in woolly fold. Now, another animal which is being described here is the sheep. The sheep is silent. We have a lot of sheep. We have a flock. And despite all the wool over the body cover of the sheep is wool. Despite all the wool on the body of the sheep, but the sheep were so cold that they were silent. They were not making any kind of sound. They were not even bleating. You know what I mean by bleating? The sound made by the sheep. Silent is an image that relates to sound, so it's an oral image. But the image of the sheep is visual. So the first four lines describe the effect of the cold weather on animals. The animals are suffering. And the use of animals is meant to show the cold and to emphasize it. The first animal is the owl. The owl is covered with feathers, but still it's very cold. The hare is limping and trembling and cannot really walk on the grass because it's frozen. The fourth one is about the sheep, and the sheep is also cold, so much so that the sheep is not bleating. All the sheep are not bleating, not only one of them, all of them are not bleating. Now, what's the effect of the cold weather on human beings? The poet says, numb were the beadsman's fingers while he told his rosary and while his frosted breath. Now, notice the use of inversion. Numb were the beadsman's fingers. It's supposed to be the beadsman's fingers were numb, but the poet used inversion to give more emphasis to the line. Now, the person who has his rosary and is actually praying to God, he cannot really move his fingers to use his beads. You know, when we use what we call masbaha in Arabic, we call it rosary in English. So he is unable to do this thing because of his numb fingers. Also, we have the use of frosted breath. The epithet frosted is a thermal image because it relates to cold weather. In order to make this clear, the poet says, like pious incense from a censer old. The poet uses a simile, and you can guess that it's a simile when you read like. So, the breath of the beadsman was likened to incense. You know, this sweet smelling thing that we burn in order to get this nice smell? This is what we call incense, and usually we burn incense in a censer. We have a censer, and we burn the incense inside of it. And you know, when we feel cold and we breathe, it seems that steam is coming out of our mouths. It's like we are smoking and we are not. So the poet likens the breath of the beadsman to the smoke made by burning incense in a censer. Now, what kind of image is this? Now, I want to tell you about images that have figures of speech and images that do not have figures of speech. So far, I told you that we have 5 senses, so we have 5 types of images. These images are visual, auditory, tactile, gustatory, and olfactory. And we added to them thermal and kinesthetic. This is the division that we have for images according to the sense that we are using. Now, there is another division that we are going to make, and this depends on the presence or absence of figures of speech in the image. If you have an image plus a figure of speech, this is what we call a figurative image. But if we have an image without a figure of speech, we call it a literal image. So what's the difference? A literal image is an image that involves no change or turn on the literal meaning of words. In other words, my role as a reader is just to imagine what the poets want me to imagine. If the poet describes a field full of daisies or roses or whatever you want to say, then my role is just to imagine. But if the poet uses a figure of speech like this one, there is an image plus a simile. In this case, my role becomes much more difficult. It's not to imagine something that we see, but also to go beyond that after we decode the figure of speech. So in a figurative image, I need to decode the figure of speech so that I can understand the image. If someone says that today is a very beautiful day because the sun is rising and the birds are singing, so what is needed is just to imagine the whole thing, and this is a literal image. But when I say the sun is smiling today, the sun is smiling today has a figure of speech, because you know that the sun does not smile. The one who smiles is the human being. So here we have personification. Probably I need to imagine that the sun is a beautiful woman and she smiles at people. So here I need to imagine the image and to decode the figure of speech as well. Now, when I say to you, please look at the moon in the middle of the sky, it is so bright and beautiful. This is easy. It is a literal image. But if I say to you, slowly, silently, now the moon walks the night in her silver shone. These 2 lines of poetry include a description of the moon, that's right, but it's not literal. The description is quite figurative, because what we have here is the poet is likening the moon to a beautiful woman wearing silver shoes, and as she walks, she turns everything into silver. So here, this image is figurative, because my role is not just to imagine the moon and its beauty, but also to use my imagination to see the moon as a woman with silver shoes, walking the night and turning everything into silver. It's something magical. It is different. So here, this kind of image is described as a figurative image, because the poet is not just describing the breath of the beadsman, but also he likens it to the smoke that comes out of a censer after we burn incense. Then the poet says that past the sweet virgin's picture, while his prayer he saith, the steam is coming out of his mouth because he's praying to God. So this is a visual image again. So as you can see, we have a combination of images in this kind of stanza, but the most important type of image is the thermal imagery. Please try to find all types of images in this stanza and try to focus on thermal images. So it seems to me that Keats, John Keats's purpose is to bring together visual images to shed light on the suffering of animals. The kinesthetic images of the numb fingers also suggests the warmth that we have in the woolly fold, serving through contrast to emphasize the cold weather. Also, we notice that the simile of the frosted breath that rose like incense is another visual image of a phenomenon possible only in extreme cold. All of these things are meant to create a thermal image that will be used skillfully by the poet later on in the poem, as he describes the warmth of young lovers later on in the poem. So the poet is trying to make this kind of juxtaposition between images of cold weather and images of warmth that is created by love. Here we come to the end of our discussion of images in poetry, because we have been discussing language devices, and we are about to conclude our discussion of language devices, but I think we are left with symbol. You know that our course, poetry, is a second-year course. So you have been exposed to poetry while you were studying Introduction to Literature. We had a section for poetry, but here is a detailed study of language devices in poetry. So I will try and reinforce your knowledge of these language devices and try to add to them. I shall revise with you the meaning of symbol, and we will try to have a poem that talks about different types of symbols, and see how poets can effectively employ symbols in poetry. Okay, now let us go very quickly and revise the meaning of symbol. I think symbols are not restricted to literature. Symbols are omnipresent. I think we can find them almost everywhere. Our life is full of symbols. For example, if I write these letters A, P, P, L, apple, they form a word, and this word stands for an objective reality. When I say to you, this is my pen, P-E-N, these letters together, which are pronounced as pen, also symbolize a thing in the objective reality. If I say, this is the flag of Palestine, and I kiss it, why do I say it's an important thing? What's a flag after all? It's a piece of cloth. But if we just think of it as a piece of cloth, I don't think we will show this kind of devotion and enthusiasm when we see our flag. Actually, there is something that goes beyond the piece of colored cloth. The flag stands for a nation. It stands for a nation. All language is symbolic in this sense. All language is symbolic in this sense. So, in a literary sense, and this is the most important, in a literary sense, what is a symbol? A symbol is a trope, T-R-O-P-E, a trope that combines between what we call a literal and sensuous quality, literal or sensuous quality, and what we call an abstract or suggestive quality. Okay, what's that? I want to explain myself. Now, when I say this is a wedding ring, this is a wedding ring. Now, the literal and the sensuous quality is the piece of gold that I have here with me. It's a piece of gold. This is what I call literal or sensuous, taken from the word sense. I can touch, I can sense it. But there is an abstract thing here. It's not the piece of gold. There is the suggestiveness of this piece of gold. This piece of gold means that I am married. Now, for another girl, it could mean she's engaged. So there is this kind of abstract noun that we have. So the idea that this piece of gold is a symbol, it means that the symbol has two qualities. One, you can touch, you can see, you can feel. This is what we call the literal or the sensuous. The other one is the abstract one, the suggestive one. It suggests that I am married. It suggests devotion. It suggests commitment, etc. So in reality, however, we have to think of all the things around us in a symbolic way. And now let us go to what we are concerned with: literary criticism that helps us understand poetry, etc. When we think of image and symbol, they are related. But when you think of the symbol, you have to say that the image is just a concrete referent in the objective world, a concrete thing. Whereas the symbol, in addition to being concrete, it suggests something beyond itself. It suggests something beyond itself. So the symbol is something that evokes an objective, concrete reality. But this objective, concrete reality is made to suggest something else or another level of meaning. Like the flag of Palestine is something that exists in reality, and this is its concrete reality. But at the same time, it suggests another level of meaning, which is love of one's own land, probably patriotism or nationalism. So the symbol does not stand for the meaning, it evokes the object that suggests the meaning. Now, literary symbols, and we are really concerned with literary symbols. We are not interested in symbols in real life, because everything in life is symbolic. You know that there is a restaurant because you have a road sign with a fork and a knife, so it is symbolic. We also know that this is a pharmacy because of the snake thing, etc. So life in general is symbolic. But we are interested in symbolism in literature. Literary symbols can be of two important types: universal and universal symbols, or what we call private symbols. Universal symbols and private symbols. Now, if we think of universal symbols, universal means global, something that relates to the whole universe. Like in general, people believe that in literature, flowing water suggests time and eternity. In general, flowing Water is all the time a symbol of eternity and probably a voyage that suggests life. The other type of symbol secures its suggestiveness from qualities qualities which are not inherent in itself, but from the way it is used in a given literary work. So, what does that mean? If you read any literary work, it is well known that the desert, for example, is a symbol of futility and hopelessness. The sun represents new beginnings. Sunset represents death. Water suggests eternity and life. All types of literature use these symbols and they are almost fixed. But if we think of something which is on the other side of the scale, we have universal symbols on one hand, and on the other we have private symbols in literature. And private symbols are literary symbols which are used in a specific way by the poet. That is, these symbols do not acquire their meaning from a quality inherent in the symbol itself, but they acquire their meaning from the way they were employed in a certain literary work. What I am trying to say is that there are poets who come up with symbols which are quite original, symbols which have never been used before. And this is part of the creativity of the poet. The poet can come up with a symbol that has never been used before by other writers. And he or she will endow this kind of symbol with meanings that can be understood within the context of the literary work itself. But outside the literary work, these things do not mean the same. Okay, what's that? For example, if any of you read The Old Man and the Sea and noticed the big marlin fish or the sharks in the novella, I think you would notice that this symbol is just existent in the novella itself, but outside the novella it doesn't mean the same. Now, the old man in the novella wanted to catch a big marlin fish. He wanted to prove that he can challenge his fate, and he can prove to himself that, yes, I am old, but I am still productive. He wanted to emphasize that he is a dignified old man. So what did he do? He decided to catch a big marlin fish, which unfortunately dragged him to the heart of the Atlantic Ocean. But after a long, tiring journey, he was able to catch the fish and to come back with it to the shore. But eventually, before he arrives to the beach, he was attacked several times by sharks. So is there anything in the objective world which says that the marlin fish represents human dignity and the human struggle to prove dignity and to defy absurdity? I don't think so. Marlin fish is just marlin fish. But in The Old Man and the Sea, the big marlin fish represents human dignity and human persistence. A human being can be tired, exhausted, but cannot be defeated. Now, the sharks represent the difficulties that we face in real life. Well, outside the novella, sharks are just sharks. So now I hope that you know what I mean by a private symbol. Another example would be Herman Melville's Moby-Dick and the use of the whale as a great symbol in the literary work. We notice that the ocean and the whale are pregnant with meanings that seem almost independent of Melville's use of them in the story. But if we think of the whale, he invested all the meanings in the whale. So the whale has certain symbols in the novel, but it's not the same outside real life. I mean, it's not the same in real life. If we also think of Herman, if we think of probably an excellent example would be The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne. The novella points to a double symbol, a color-coded of the alphabet, developed into an interesting symbol. I remember the female protagonist of the story was condemned to wear an embroidered thing on her bosom, something that shows the letter A in red on her clothes, and A stands for adulteress. But later on, as life changed and people really changed, they started to figure out what the letter stands for. In the past, it used to stand for adultery. But right now, people started to wonder, is it possible that this letter is the initial of the word able? Or could it be angel? So if you think of this letter, A, it is just the first letter of the English alphabets. But in The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne, the letter A was endowed with meaning about ambivalence, about how people change through time, how even the way we look at things can vary from one person to another, and how things are not always what they seem to be. But if I ask someone who did not read The Scarlet Letter, I don't think that he or she will give such possible meanings. Okay? So, to wrap up, the last language device that we are going to discuss is symbol. Symbol is something that is itself and yet stands for something else. The symbol has two aspects. One of them is literal and the other one is abstract. Literal could also be called sensuous, and abstract could also mean suggestive. The other thing is literary symbols are the most important thing we are concerned with. Literary symbols are two types, universal and private symbols. Universal symbols are symbols which are employed in literature, and they have been used all the time to have the same meaning, like something related to water, the desert, trees, the sea. There are certain fixed associations that we have when we deal with these symbols. However, we have something that pertains to the creativity of the poet and his ability to produce different symbols. This is what we call literary symbols, and literary symbols are symbols which acquire their meanings from the way they have been employed in a certain literary work, but outside this literary work, these symbols do not mean the same. So our task next time is going to be reading two poems. One of them employs a universal symbol, and the other one employs what we call a private symbol, which is a subdivision of what we call literary symbols. Till then, thank you very much. See you next time. Goodbye. Keep studying.